Just before we get into the episode today, I do want to talk about our fantastic sponsor, and that is Surfshark, who are big into privacy, just like you should be, and just like you can be after you get Surfshark. Look, if you're online, it's not just your ISP who can be spying on you. It can be any bad actor who's just a little bit smart, a little bit working out how to hack on that unsecure Starbucks Wi-Fi or something, you know? It's not safe out there. But with Surfshark, you can stay safe because they encrypt all of your traffic. It works also on unlimited devices, so whether you want to browse on your phone, your laptop, your tablet, whatever, they cover everything. It's also got tools like CleanWeb, which blocks ads and malware, and Multi-Op, which allows you to route your traffic through multiple countries for extra privacy. And yes, you can also use it to unblock region-restricted conflicts, can't you? You get all those extra Netflix libraries. Surfshark just works, it's ridiculously easy to use, and right now I've got a special deal for you. Go to surfshark.com/ITS or use the code ITS at checkout and get 4 extra months of Surfshark for free. And now today's video. On August the 4th, 2020, one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions in human history tore through Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. It appeared to be a sudden catastrophe, a freak accident, but it wasn't. The blast was not the breaking point, it was a revelation. It exposed the true condition of the government in Lebanon, stripping away any pretense for all the world to see. For decades, the country had been dragged along under a sectarian system engineered to maintain peace after a bloody civil war. What was initially intended as a temporary solution quickly became a permanent arrangement. Corruption took root, accountability evaporated, and the entire nation became paralyzed. As officials bickered and delayed taking meaningful action, 2,750 tons of highly explosive chemicals continued to decay in the heart of the capital, a literal ticking time bomb. When it finally detonated, it claimed more than 200 lives. The explosion was not the beginning of Lebanon's collapse, it was the most vivid indication of a failed state, one whose institutions had long since stopped protecting its own citizens. This is the story of how such an explosion occurred, what it revealed, and why, even 5 years later, almost nothing has changed. The afternoon of August 4th, 2020 set in motion a transformation that would affect the country for years to come. At 5:40 p.m. local time, Beirut's fire department received a call reporting smoke coming from warehouse number 12, one among a string of storage facilities at Beirut's sprawling port. Fire crews were dispatched, and at first it seemed like just another day on the job. However, upon arrival, as they began to work to extinguish the flames, small explosions erupted inside the warehouse. Fireworks. Although these blasts posed risks to the firefighters, they did not seem catastrophic, so the crew continued their efforts. Meanwhile, the rest of Beirut remained oblivious to the growing inferno at the port, just going about their day as normal. Dr. Isra Sablani, aged 29, found herself in the midst of a photo shoot in her wedding gown. And at 6:08 p.m., it happened. Beirut was struck by one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Flames spread quickly to the stored ammonium nitrate, igniting all 2,750 tons at once. This chemical, commonly used in fertilizers, is extremely volatile in its pure form. It was the same substance chosen by Timothy McVeigh, who used just 2 tons of it to demolish the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people. In Beirut, however, over 1,000 times that amount had been neglected for nearly a full decade in a port warehouse. The blast sent a shockwave that shattered windows at the city's airport over 5 miles away and was even heard as far away as Cyprus. The firefighter brigade on the scene was immediately killed, along with countless others nearby. Outside the immediate kill zone, many more lost their lives due to shattering glass, collapsing structures, and other forms of damage. In total, no fewer than 218 people died in the blast, and an additional 7,000 were injured, many severely. In a matter of seconds, the city became unrecognizable. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble, with an enormous orange plume rising above the ruins. Windows were blown out for miles, and roads buckled under the force of the blast. No city's hospitals are fully prepared for mass triage situations like this, but Beirut's medical infrastructure was particularly unready for the seemingly endless waves of wounded who flooded in. Bloodied civilians staggered along streets littered with glass, some desperately searching for loved ones, others seeking medical treatment. Makeshift triage centers quickly emerged in parking lots where doctors treated patients by flashlight as medical supplies ran out within hours. The resulting chaos was simply overwhelming. As the initial dust settled, the true scale of the blast's damage became evident. Early estimates placed the value of destroyed or severely damaged buildings at $15 billion. No fewer than 77,000 apartments were obliterated, leaving countless people homeless. In total, 300,000 residents of Beirut were displaced. This is not an event from which recovery could occur in days, weeks, or even months. Instead, the rebuilding process promised to be a years-long project, even under the best possible conditions. Now, it wouldn't take long for shock to yield to rage. Within 24 hours, a grisly truth began to emerge. This wasn't some freak accident. Not only was it completely preventable, but the government had long known that the substance which caused the explosion had been stored in the port for years. While Beirut's residents mourned their deceased loved ones, they were forced to endure a second wave of trauma as they questioned how such negligence could have been allowed. So, how does something like this happen? That was a question on every Lebanese person's mind, as well as that of the broader international community in the days following the blast. This was not a forgotten munitions depot left over from the Civil War. More troubling still was the fact that such a catastrophe could occur in the very heart of the country's capital, or even more shockingly, in its port. In the hours following the explosion, as Beirut's residents searched for answers, they uncovered a grisly truth. The 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate that decimated their city had arrived in 2013, 7 years before the disaster, aboard the cargo ship MV Rosas, which had docked in Beirut after suffering mechanical failures. The vessel would never leave port again, as the Russia-based company that owned it simply abandoned the ship. The crew had warned port authorities that they were carrying what amounted to a mega bomb, and the chemical was transferred from the ship into an interior warehouse for safe keeping. Temporarily, of course. Now, we all know how that turned out. Despite the government's inaction, customs officials at the port sent letter after letter to judges, ministers, and government bodies urging them to address the danger of storing such a large quantity of explosives in a warehouse that coincidentally also housed fireworks. Not one of those people stepped in to take action. And when all of this came to light, Beirut erupted in fury. On August the 10th, tens of thousands of protesters flooded Martyr Square in the heart of the city, sending a clear message. The government had failed and it had to go. The protests quickly escalated into outright rage, with demonstrators storming government ministries. Notably, the foreign ministry became a focal point where protesters established headquarters of the revolution and destroyed effigies of political leaders. Although security forces responded swiftly, it was evident that they were hopelessly outnumbered. Whatever remained of the government's legitimacy had evaporated. On August the 10th, Prime Minister Hassan Diab addressed the nation to announce the resignation of his government, the first step of what would be a long road back to legitimacy. Yet for many Lebanese, the damage was already done. The entire political system, which had been entrenched in decades of gridlock and complicity, could not be fixed by merely replacing the figurehead at the top. In the aftermath of the blast and the ensuing public outcry, it seemed for just a moment that Lebanon's government might finally tackle its systemic failures. An independent investigation was set up to examine the explosion, with Judge Fadi Sarwan appointed as its head. Within just a few short months, he managed what many believed was impossible in the country, charging 4 senior officials with criminal negligence. These charges included former Finance Minister Ali Hassan Khalil and ousted Prime Minister Hassan Diab. In a nation where government officials had long enjoyed broad legal immunity, this move sent shockwaves through the system. For a brief moment, after decades of inaction and gridlock, there was a growing sense that perhaps Lebanon's governmental structure was finally beginning to change. The political establishment had other ideas. Although Diab was technically an independent, he'd risen to power with the backing of mostly Shiite parties, most notably Hezbollah. These parties quickly moved to cover their man by accusing Sarwan of political bias. Their objective was clear: stall the process, question the legitimacy of anyone who investigated their people, and set an example for anyone who dared to cross them. By February 2021, they'd succeeded. Under the guise of bias, Sarwan was removed from the case. The alleged bias stemmed from the fact that he owned property damaged by the explosion. In a country where even the capital city had been shaken to its core, it was telling that an investigator could be sidelined for being a victim. Judge Tarek Bitar was promptly appointed as his replacement, and he set out to continue the investigation. Unsurprisingly, the same faction soon found fault with Bitar as well. It became clear that their issue was not with Sarwan personally, but with the investigation itself. Accountability was just simply too much to ask. The situation only deteriorated from there. Several arrest warrants issued by Bitar were flatly ignored, with those charged hiding behind parliamentary immunity. Undeterred, Bitar once again charged senior political officials in the country with criminal negligence, including Prosecutor General Ghassan Ouidat and 2 top intelligence chiefs. In response, Ouidat ordered the release of all detainees who had been charged in connection with the blast since 2020, effectively nullifying his own case and demonstrating how Lebanon's broken political system prevents justice from being served. As of 2025, the investigation remains stalled. Victims' families continue to hold silent vigils demanding justice. To date, not a single official has been tried or convicted for the explosion. As a result of Ouidat's directive, all suspects walked free, and the truth remains marred in politics. Lebanon, though, was never destined to become a failed state or a place where an entire city, even the nation's capital, could be compromised by its government's own negligence. For many years, it shone as a beacon of hope in an otherwise troubled region. After the Lebanese civil war ended in the mid-1990s, a fragile peace paved the way for dramatic economic expansion and rising prosperity for its people. Between 1990 and 2000, the country's GDP grew by an astonishing 400%. More than half of the economy relied on trade, tourism, and financial services, with Lebanese banks providing considerably more security than their regional counterparts. This robust performance earned Lebanon the nickname the Switzerland of the Middle East. The fall from these heights was avoidable. Peace was achieved between warring Christian and Muslim groups by essentially dividing the government along religious lines. The Middle East may be many things, but simple ain't one of them. The 1989 peace deal that ended the Civil War recognized 18 separate religious factions, with the largest groups being the Maronite Christians, Shiite Muslims, and Sunni Muslims. Certain positions in government must be filled by members of these communities. For instance, the president must be a Christian, the prime minister must be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament must be a Shiite Muslim, among others. Similarly, seats in parliament are allocated along these lines: 64 for Christians, subdivided by denomination, and 64 for Muslims, likewise subdivided. Designed to prevent any single religious group from dominating the others, the system essentially organized society along religious lines. Now, while this idea may be difficult for some Western audiences to grasp, the underlying premise was that society was simply too divided along these lines to achieve peace without a power-sharing arrangement. Now, Lebanon was not the first case for this type of structure. Northern Ireland, for example, operates a less rigid version between nationalist Catholics and unionist Protestants, although that's definitely a story for another video. The primary issue, however, is that sectarian system, referred to in Lebanon as the confessionalism, was never intended to be permanent. The TAIF agreement, reached after 15 years of near constant internal fighting, was meant to serve as a transitional measure designed to ease tensions among the various sectarian groups. Instead, it has evolved into a sort of second constitution, widely recognized for deepening sectarian divides and causing governmental gridlock. In a system where Muslim parties are guaranteed 50% of the seats, who really cares about a report from the Port Authority concerning glorified fertilizer? If something goes wrong, blame it on the Christians. And of course, vice versa. Regardless, the seats in parliament already set. Another unique feature of Lebanon's legal system is its constitutional immunity from prosecution for most officials. Prosecuting a sitting or former government figure requires Parliament's approval, a procedure that, as you can imagine, rarely happens. Little bit of a conflict of interest there. One might think an exception would be made given the magnitude of the blast and the extent of the government's negligence, but that's not the case. The mechanism, originally intended to prevent post-war vendettas from turning the nation's courts into factionalized arenas for retribution over past crimes, has instead shielded the political elite from ongoing accountability. Lebanon's eventual collapse into failed state status was driven by the gradual erosion of power held by Hezbollah, both politically and militarily. Long before its rise, Hezbollah was a fixture in the country's politics. However, its influence expanded rapidly after the 2006 war with Israel. In that conflict, the group claimed a symbolic victory and gained quasi-legitimacy as a domestic paramilitary force operating with considerable freedom within Lebanon's borders. Then, in 2008, following violent clashes with rival factions in Beirut, Hezbollah secured an even greater share of political power through the Doha Agreement, a development that marked its transformation into a central national political player. By the early 2000s, Hezbollah had essentially become a state within a state, boasting its own armed forces, intelligence wing, border patrol, and even an independent foreign policy, all distinct distinct from the official Lebanese government. This had disastrous effects on the political stability and legitimacy of the country. While the official government remained gridlocked along sectarian lines, Hezbollah seized the opportunity to fill the void, both militarily and in terms of governance. Its growing dominance effectively paralyzed the national government, allowing the group to act independently and without oversight. Moreover, Hezbollah's activities, which have earned it a place on international terrorist watch lists, have repeatedly dragged Lebanon into conflicts with the global community, conflicts the nation could really ill afford. The failure of the Lebanese state to contain Hezbollah not only weakened its sovereignty, but also revealed just how limited the central government's authority truly was. With power fragmented and key institutions either paralyzed or co-opted, a perfect storm was created for this explosive situation to unfold. We're now nearly 5 years past the explosion, and Beirut remains a shell of its former self. In the 2 years following the incident, the blast site received only minimal cleanup. Government gridlock prevented approval of even basic recovery measures. It wasn't until fermenting grains left in semi-destroyed silos caught fire in the extreme Middle Eastern heat of July 2022 that the government was forced to take even the simplest steps toward cleanup. Lebanon's economy remains shattered, with hyperinflation running rampant for years and a staggering 80% of its citizens living below the poverty line. The Lebanese pound, once securely pegged to the US dollar at a rate of 1,500 to 1, collapsed in a fashion reminiscent of Zimbabwe's crisis, reaching over £100,000 per dollar in 2023. Banks, once symbols of Lebanese security and stability, have begun denying citizens access to their own deposits. Meanwhile, the port of Beirut, which at one point handled more than 70% of Lebanon's imports and was the busiest port in the eastern Mediterranean, remains barely functional. The Switzerland of the Middle East is no more, as the country has descended into severe economic turmoil. Collapses of this scale, they often create a snowball effect. As conditions worsen, both personnel and capital leave the country, while new investment is simultaneously discouraged. As a result, Lebanese GDP has dropped by over 50% since 2018, a decline that the World Bank ranks as among the worst 3 global financial disasters of the past century. Further complicating the country's recovery is the ongoing issue of how to handle Hezbollah, which has continued to trouble the region well after the explosion. The International Peacekeeping Mission, UNIFIL, established by the UN Security Council following the 2006 war with Israel, was intended to accompany and support the Lebanese armed forces in the southern parts of the country, where they were tasked with preventing a resurgence of Hezbollah along the border with Israel. However, as the government has proven both unwilling and unable to fulfill this role, UNIFIL's presence has faltered. It lacked both the authority and the means to enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which prohibited a build-up of paramilitary forces south of the Litani River. Hezbollah wasted no time in taking action, a move that further complicated Lebanon's position after Israel launched its ongoing military campaign in Gaza in the wake of the October 7th terrorist attacks. Demonstrating its solidarity with the Palestinians, Hezbollah escalated tensions by engaging in a series of regular cross-border military exchanges. Between October 2023 and September 2024, the group carried out roughly 1,900 cross-border attacks into its southern neighbor, prompting the evacuation of more than 90,000 Israelis. In retaliation, Israel initiated a sweeping campaign targeting Hezbollah positions across southern Lebanon and even extending its strikes into major cities like Beirut. Throughout this process, the Lebanese state was effectively sidelined. It had no say, no strategy, and no capacity to intervene. While Hezbollah pursued an aggressive military campaign, the official government remained on the sidelines, rendered powerless as a domestic paramilitary force dragged the nation into a conflict it neither chose nor was equipped to fight. The question of whether Israel was justified in this campaign is a story for another day, but suffice it to say that the damage to Lebanon was extensive. Although much of the strikes and limited ground incursion focused in the south, attacks occurred throughout the country, including the capital. The World Bank estimates that the conflict has caused $11 billion worth of damage. The destruction from last year's conflict only deepened the wounds left by the explosion. Rebuilding physical infrastructure is one challenge, but restoring a country plagued by decades of sectarian dysfunction, that's going to require a whole lot more effort. Nearly 5 years after the explosion that devastated Beirut, Lebanon stands at a crossroads. The blast was not merely a tragic accident. It served as an undeniable bit of evidence of the profound rot at the heart of the Lebanese state's failed design. Decades of sectarian division, systemic corruption, and institutionalized paralysis converged into a single moment of unimaginable devastation from which the country has yet to fully recover. Today, the same gridlock system remains in place. Although Hezbollah was largely defeated militarily in last year's conflict with Israel, it still commands significant domestic political influence and has recently shown signs of rearming in the south. Meanwhile, even though the currency has recovered from the worst levels of hyperinflation seen in 2023, the overall economy continues to languish. Lebanon boasts a vibrant history and a potentially strong future, but realizing that future would require a radical transformation of the entire political system. Without dismantling the sectarian power-sharing model and taking decisive action to prevent another paramilitary build-up, Lebanon remains vulnerable to future crises. Lebanese citizens are faced with a stark choice in a region where religious divisions run deep. Either confront and reform the very foundations of their failed state, or remain trapped in cycles of war, devastation, and political paralysis. If recent events are any indication, the tragedy of Beirut may not solely be defined by the blast itself, but by the unsettling possibility that even an explosion of this magnitude might not spark the fundamental change that is needed. Thank you for watching.